Hi there, and welcome to another A Tippling Philosopher video. Today, I'm excited to speak to someone. Part of the reason I'm excited to speak to him is because I've never spoken to him before. So this is quite an interesting way of getting to know each other, is through a formal interview. We are friends now on Facebook. So his name is Ed Dodge, and he contacted me because I've been doing a series on a resurrection with Derek Lambert on Myth Vision concerning my book, The Resurrection, A Critical Examination of the Easter Story, and obviously wrapped up with the whole skeptical approach to analyzing the resurrection is the idea that there are naturalistic hypotheses that better explain the data than the Christian hypothesis. Now, I haven't actually got onto that part of the book in the video series yet, but Ed contacted me to say, hey, look, I've written some stuff on the Swoon theory, and we'll talk about exactly what that is in a second. How about you take a read and we can get together and talk about it? So I thought, yeah, that's brilliant. Absolutely right up my alley. So anyway, we'll get onto that. But hi, Ed. Thanks so much for coming along. I know it's early for you over in the States. Do you want to introduce yourself and say, a little bit about how you got involved in all this kind of stuff?
Yeah, hi, John. It's great to be with you here, and nice to meet you for the first time here. It's the first time we've spoken, so this is cool. I've been watching your videos. I've been enjoying them. I want to say, I agree with most of what you say, a lot of it, but not everything.
Yeah.
So I think we can have a fruitful discussion here. So I'm basically an independent writer and researcher. I wrote this book, History of the Goddess, from the Ice Age to the Bible, where I delve into the Israelite paganism, the Asherah, the Israelite mother goddess, and the transition from Israelite paganism to Jewish monotheism. But that's another conversation for another day. I also, in the book, I also go into the New Testament and the Jesus story. Now, I did not, and I talk about the Swoon theory in there. Now, I did not invent any of this stuff. Swoon theory has been around for an awful long time. The Muslims, they think Jesus was seen alive after the crucifixion.
Well, actually, I suppose before you go on, should we just explain what the Swoon theory is? Obviously, because not everyone.
Swoon theory is simply that Jesus survived the crucifixion, that he appeared to be dead, but he wasn't really dead. So it's not a particularly complicated theory. I don't think it's not a new theory. But I have a specific angle on mine version, which again, I did not invent it. It originally comes from a fellow, The Passover Plot by Hugh Schonenfeld. I think he wrote it back in the 60s. And he described, basically, he calls it the Passover Plot, that it was a political stunt, that Jesus was out to, he had political machinations going, and that basically faked his death with a sedative on the cross, that the wine vinegar that they feed him directly before he expires, that was a sedative. Now, Schonenfeld does not describe what that sedative was. He does not attempt to name the drug. Now, the next step was a fellow named Chris Bennett. So let me step back for myself a little bit. I got into all this stuff by studying the history of cannabis and the history of cannabis and religion. Something I've been studying for a long time. That's what led to History of the Goddess. I was looking at cannabis in the Old Testament and trying to figure out if it had anything to do with Asherah and these pagans, which in fact it does. So this fellow Chris Bennett is a friend of mine. He's a noted cannabis scholar. He's written a bunch of books on cannabis and in ancient religions and Hinduism and all over the place. He's terrific. Got a lot of books. He pointed out, he had read Schonenfeld's book and pointed out that cannabis would be a perfect sedative that would in fact, medically speaking, do what's being described. It'll knock you out for 2 days, make you look like you're dead. It has a cataleptic effect, which is well documented in science. We'll get into
what do you mean? Oh, right. We'll get into that. Yeah.
Well, the cataleptic effect in catalepsy, it's like when your limbs are all stiff and waxy and like you're a corpse.
Yeah.
So Chris Bennett wrote about this more than 20 years ago. He's written about it in a bunch of his books, but never got much attention for it. But when I read it, I thought, this is quite incredible because, the resurrection is arguably the most important question in Western civilization. What is the truth behind the resurrection? Because this lays bare the authority of the Catholic Church and of Christianity and everything. So it's quite an important question. So then I
broadly very much agree with you, because that was a opening premise in my book, which is the idea that without and Paul would agree with this. Without the resurrection, you don't really get a meaningful Christianity. I mean, it's hard to make sense of Christianity theologically without the resurrection. So you start pulling that apart, it unravels the whole Christian worldview. So absolutely.
Yeah, and so now I will say now Christians have a variety of worldviews. There's not one single. Now there's a single strict Christian theology, but in practice, Christians have a wide degree of views. So I grew up in a Presbyterian church here in America, and we were taught to look for naturalistic explanations for everything. We were not taught that to read the Bible literally. And I went to church, every Sunday, right through till I was 18. We were always taught to look for naturalistic explanations for things. We were told that the fundamentalists had it wrong. This is what I learned in church, was not to read. There's a lot of ways to read the Bible, but the one way that's certainly not correct is to read it literally. So that's what I was taught in church. So I never bought into like fundamentalist approaches that you had to read the Bible literally. And I've always read the Bible that way. And so for me, the looking at the swoon theory was perfectly natural within the way that I was raised. Now, we never talked about that in church. That was not something we went into. So I can't say I learned that swoon theory in church, but the notion of looking for naturalistic explanations behind things like, the loaves and fishes on the Sermon on the Mount, that kind of thing. We always taught that as that was a potluck. Everybody brought their food to the picnic. And once a couple people brought out a couple loaves and fishes, then everybody else brought out what they had packed away as well. And that it was a perfectly natural way to explain all these stories. But with the swoon theory, I guess just to step back, what I add to the story over what Chris did is that I really put the women at the center of the story. I put Mary Magdalene, and I sort of blend it. Now there's a scholarship approach, and then there's like a storytelling approach. So let's talk with the scholarship approach, and we'll go into the story, because I am turning this into an art project and a storytelling project as well. So that's another conversation though. But let's stick to the scholarship right now.
People have sort of tried to write fiction. I think Pullman has, the author of his Dark Materials, has done sort of a Jesus fictional narrative. I think it is certainly a lot of scope for really producing some interesting narrative around what might have happened. I suppose there are several problems with, or going back to the scholarly approach, is trying to work out a single kind of narrative of what happened, given that the four gospels are pretty contradictory or divergent in a lot of the claims. So reading your piece on the swoon theory, on your swoon theory, how many women were there? Were there?
Oh yeah, sure.
All the Marys?
Yeah, all the details are very
the
details are all incredibly imprecise, contradictory, as you say. The precise names of who's there, what the context is, none of it's very clear at all. Which also just really makes it amazing that the church claims so much authority based on such a vague set of stories. That was actually kind of what drove me out of the church. I also had though I was raised Presbyterian, I ended up going to a Catholic high school, and so for those couple of years I was getting church 6 days a week. And when they taught us the Catholic version of the resurrection, I was shocked at how weak all the claims were when I was a teenager, and that pretty much drove me out of the church back then. Like after I was 18, I said I'd never call myself a Christian again.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I draw on a lot of work of Raymond Brown, for example, who's a great Catholic exegete, but who would be seen as really liberal these days in a lot of contexts, certainly with your more literalist and fundamentalist sort of that kind of exegesis that takes place these days. I know from my blog a number of Catholic commenters who seem to have gone to some form of evangelical fundamentalist Catholicism. It's almost like Catholicism has felt threatened by evangelical Protestantism and has reacted. Some of the adherents have reacted against that to become like young Earth creationist Catholics and so it's just a weird. But America's just full of weird church activity. There you go.
I mean, I'm of the opinion. I say this all the time. I think these old religions are failing. We're watching them fail in front of our eyes. People are leaving the church in droves, and the people that are remaining, people are reacting to new information by either leaving the church or doubling down on it.
Yeah.
And so people that are remaining behind are totally doubling down on everything. Meanwhile, loads of people are leaving. So, and it puts us into a dangerous moment in history where our old religions are failing us, but nothing new has emerged yet. And so it becomes a very chaotic time.
Yeah, sort of polarization and that doubling down, that backfire effect, that psychological effect of like entrenching in your original position even more, I suppose is a way the
Yeah, it's
that's
very
manifested.
reactionary, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So carry on. So swoon, and just to remind, swoon, the word swoon comes from falling unconscious, to be swooned, I think is the original sort of etymology of that. But just to anyway, carry on.
Yeah, and so so I fully appreciate the mythicist position. You know, the work you've done, Richard Carrier's done, Robert Price has
I mean,
done.
I'm not a mythicist, but yeah, carry on.
Okay, well, I don't let me put any words in your mouth, but the work of Richard Carrier and other folks who have really, make a very valid point that the Gospels at face value, you can tease them apart and reduce them to nothing and reduce them to all known literary tropes or known symbolic motifs and religious narratives that have been repeated over and over again, and that there's nothing necessarily original in any of it. And I appreciate that you can take that logical approach and reduce Jesus to never having existed at all. That is a rational approach and mentally reasonable approach to the evidence. I just don't happen to 100% agree with it, because I do think that there is enough, at least anecdotal evidence, that there was Jesus the man who did live and walk around and do his thing, and that inspired Jesus the God later on.
I completely agree. So I would, although like yourself, I really rate a lot of Richard Carrier's work, and I've worked with him. I worked with him to some degree on that text, but I also rate a lot of Bart Ehrman's work, for example, classics of Ehrman Carrier, like dichotomy there. But so I really like, so in reading Jesus Before the Gospels by Bart Ehrman, which I think is a fantastic book, because it gives you a great understanding of how the Gospels might have come to be written, how memory works. And he was talking about gist memories, and I really sort of think that this is the core, foundation of my historicism, which is that you've got these core gist elements of Jesus' life. So Jesus was born in Nazareth, or was from Nazareth. He came to Jerusalem, pissed off some people, whether that be the Sanhedrin or the Romans is up for debate, by obviously being an itinerant preacher and making some claims, pissed off some people, got executed. There you go. That's broadly it. And everything else is mythology that's built onto that. Arguably, even the whole empty tomb claim. So I mean, we'll come to that, but trying to unpick what is probably fact. He might have said certain sayings. I think there's some sayings that we could probably say that he claimed and said. But other than that, there's a lot of inference, and it's all about probability. So yeah, that I would go along with that kind of thesis for Jesus' historicism.
Yeah, no, I'm basically with you on that. I'm 100% with you on that. I would just make the simple point that the entire edifice of the story of the Christian narrative is that he was in fact seen alive after the crucifixion. This is Paul's central tenet. As I was mentioning before, the Muslims believe this as well. And the Muslims believe Jesus was a holy man and a prophet in line with Muhammad, but just that he wasn't divine. And so I actually think it's perfectly reasonable, based on a straight reading of the text, to discern that how his death was faked, how he was removed from the cross before he was dead. And I place the women at the center of the story, the women Jesus was well known to have had close relations. I'm not saying they were sexual. I don't think they were sexual at all. I think he's chaste. I think these are student-teacher relationships, including with Mary Magdalene. That's my interpretation of events. And so, but it's well documented throughout all four Gospels that he has numerous close relationships with women that were not the norm for society of the time. That he went out of his way to be, friends with women, and that Mary Magdalene in particular was a controversial person to be friends with, and that she was the one who was arguably closest to him, and that they were the ones that were there at the crucifixion. And so, one argument that the apologists will make is that they say one of the best claims for the resurrection is that the women were the witnesses, and that women were not considered reliable witnesses. So that the gospel writers would not have put the women there as witnesses if they weren't really there. And the fact that the women were the witnesses is one of the best arguments they make that the whole thing really happened.
Yeah, the criterion of embarrassment. I mean, I talked about this. This is exactly what my last video with Derek Lambert on Myth Vision was about, the women at the tomb. Yeah, so this is a really common apologist approach.
Now, I simply say the women weren't just witnesses; that they were responsible for the whole thing. Because one thing I noticed in your work, John, was that you seemed, at least I didn't watch every single video you've done or read all your books, but I watched a bunch of them, and I didn't see you talking about the wine vinegar that is served to him. So he gets taken to the crucifixion, he's nailed to the cross, and then immediately before he expires, 3 of the gospels, as we pointed out, the gospels are pretty contradictory, but where you have the same details, i.e., a lot of women around, i.e., Mary Magdalene being around, where you have the same details in all the gospels, then that's, I would consider to be pretty important and of higher validity when the same detail repeats. So we have 3 out of the 4 gospels have Jesus receiving this mysterious potion, a wine vinegar, which no one seems to know what wine vinegar would actually be or why you would give somebody vinegar on the cross. There's no reason that I'm aware of that you would want to give that to somebody.
Yeah, well, there's some.
Do you have an explanation for what the wine vinegar might be?
So there's some theories that it's cheap wine, which is, that I think there's a Roman type of cheap wine. So one theory is that the Roman soldiers would have had some of that hanging around because hot day and that's what you drink. And so that's what they're giving him. You've also got reference to Psalm 69, I think it is, which is
the strong drink. You have strong drink.
Yeah, so let's see if I can share my screen. Hang on a second.
Well, while you're doing that, I'll just make the point that strong drink is a term that in the ancient world, drugs were mixed into wine and beer. And this is how plant drugs were served: cannabis, opium, ephedra, myrrh. These kinds of things would be mixed with wine, served for various intoxicating or stupefying effects.
Yeah. So can you see that on the screen?
Yes, I can see it.
Yeah, so Psalm 69 is one of the Psalms that supposedly is being drawn on in various places. Psalm 22, Psalm 34, a bunch of them.
One that I was talking
about. And I waited for sympathy, but there was none. And for comforters, I found none. So the idea that he's been mocked. And also, they also gave me a bitter herb in my food. And for my thirst, they gave me vinegar to drink. So, arguably that's a case of trawling back through the Old Testament to find particular completely out of context quotes that are in the same way that they use the casting lots for clothes and all these kind of things that just a bit randomly thrown in there, but it's almost like they're pick and then throw it all at Jesus in the hope that it validates his death and somehow kind of semi-prophesies it. But sorry, carry on.
Oh yeah, so I was actually the one I was thinking was in the Psalms. It was Proverbs 31:6, which says, "Give strong drink to the one who is perishing, and wine to those in bitter distress."
Yeah.
So again, strong drink would be wine mixed with drugs that they would serve to a person on the way to the execution, both to calm their nerves and as a sedative. And so then when Jesus is on his way to Golgotha, to the hill, they initially give him some, they offer him some, and in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, they have him, Mark 15:23, they tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Then in Matthew, they gave him wine mixed with gall to drink, but when he tasted it, he would not drink it. Same thing in Luke.
So that's to do with the idea that would have some pain relieving properties,
right? But he doesn't take it. But he doesn't take it. So what my argument is, my hypothesis is that was the wrong drink. So he didn't want it to mess up because he's got a plan. He's doing this intentionally, so that he's got a. So my whole argument is that Jesus' entire last week of his ministry is a big political stunt. That he repeatedly predicts his death. He repeatedly predicts that to his disciples that he will die and rise again. It's in I don't know, nearly a dozen times at least. There's a bunch of references to it that I quote in my article here, and I'll link to my article. I haven't posted it yet online, but I will post it here. So my argument is that it's a big political stunt. He's doing this intentionally. He knows he's going to, he goes to the temple to kick over the money changers. He knows this is going to make everybody mad. He knows that it's going to get him brought up on trial, and so he intentionally, says things that will get him condemned, so that he can do this big David Copperfield crossed with Evil Knievel stunt where he's going to like break his bones and such, but he's going to pull off this big public stunt. And yeah, it's an outrageous thing to do. It's completely insane. It's crazy, but it's not impossible. And people do outrageous things all the time. So
yeah, I think there's several things to say to that. So first of all, let's just remind ourselves that there are three options here for what happened to Jesus. So either he, well, let's think, he appeared, as a Christian would believe, he died and resurrected and appeared again, or he died and some other, or he didn't appear, sorry, or he died and he did appear. So the two skeptics, so the Christians say he died and appeared and was because he's resurrected. The skeptics say he died, didn't appear, and all of it's made up, or he died and he did appear, and there's something that can explain the appearance. Now, when we talk about appearances, then we've got two options again, which is one, those appearances can be explained in terms of visions and hallucinations, and so on and so forth, and also getting made up and stuff like that, or embellished, or that there was someone really there, which is where your theory would fit into that, which is they are really seeing someone, in this case Jesus. And there are other theories as well, like a twin theory, so they're seeing like someone that they think is Jesus because it's an identical twin, but actually, etc., etc. Now, what's interesting with all of the alternative theories, all the naturalistic theories, is that no matter how outrageous they might seem prima facie, so someone might listen to your swoon theory here and say, well, that's ridiculous, right? That's, and hopefully you'll say, oh, no, actually it's not ridiculous. But even if they did think it was ridiculous, it's still more probable than the Christian theory. And that's what's really important to say here, that if you're listening to Ed Dodge presenting his theory and think that's a ridiculous theory, it is still more probable. We have precedents for that kind of thing happening, and it's therefore more probable than a dying, rising God-man spirit who resurrects into heaven as a God-man spirit to atone for the sins of humanity.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. So Jesus gets himself executed. He gets himself arrested. He does not flee, does not attempt. He's waiting in the Garden of Gethsemane, waiting to be arrested. He knew it was coming. He could have run off into the night and tried to flee, but no, he waits till like 2, 3, 4 in the morning for them to come and get him.
So this is premeditated, as opposed to him being given something that he wasn't aware he was going to get given, you would say.
Well, speaking to getting arrested, he knew that was coming.
Oh, but as in the plan for going unconscious and coming back alive, was this something that Jesus had premeditated, or is it something that is
premeditated? Now there's another argument that maybe the women simply rescued him. I acknowledge this in the paper that maybe this is not planned at all, and the women simply rescued him off the cross by slipping him a sedative. But that would negate the notion that he predicted it multiple times and did this whole thing as a political stunt.
Oh, right. I'm with you.
So I'm arguing that the whole thing was a political stunt, just based on a straight reading of the text. So what I tried to do in my paper is just take the gospel text straight, just give it a straight reading, and then argue a naturalistic explanation for it. And so he gets arrested. He goes, the Christians like to say that he's then beaten within an inch of his life. There's no way he could survive this, horrific whipping and beating down and everything. But, because we got this whole history of the passion plays, and we may have seen Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, where Jesus is just, brutally, sadistically tortured, and it's just so cruel. And they've got these whips where they're whipping open his, laying open his back down to the bone and everything. That's the tradition of the passion plays, but really the Gospels don't say that at all. The Gospels don't provide any detail of his injuries at all. They say he was whipped. They say he was beaten. He's obviously, stabbed, he's nailed through the, wrists and feet, and he's stabbed in the side. And these are all serious injuries, no doubt. But they're not definitively fatal. And they're no worse than, being tossed through a, windshield of a car and, breaking your bones in a car accident. So, people do survive serious injuries if they have prompt and effective medical care. And that's what I'm arguing he had. So he goes on the cross. The women are all around. And so part of it is I want to step back into, I'm blending this in with the mystery religions, and which were, I argue in my other book, sort of an overarching case I make is that the mystery religions were goddess religions. These are women-led religions that are rooted in the Divine Mother, and these traditions of the Divine Mother, and that are these cycle of life traditions that these dying, rising God stories are. All the important ones are all about these cycle of life and rooted in nature traditions. And so these were things that women were doing, that women were leading, and women were the potion makers. They were the ones who do plant drugs. They were the ones who had this knowledge, and this was women's business. And so when the women who were around Jesus, they were the ones who would have known about how to make these kinds of potions, because this stuff would have been, not to say common knowledge, but available knowledge in these communities. And so Mary Magdalene, they say she had 7 demons thrown out of her. I think that could be symbolic of her having come out of the mystery traditions, that, where they've got the 7 gates to knowledge, and seven is a big symbolic term that, appears over and over again in these traditions. So I think you can make the case that Mary Magdalene is coming out of the mystery religions and has this knowledge. And so the knowledge of potions and things is completely reasonable. And so when he's up on the cross,
I'm no great knowledge on the mystery religions, which are your sort of secret cultish religions of the Greco-Roman world. Would they be prevalent in Jerusalem?
Absolutely. The religions of Ishtar, of Astarte, which are the Israelite Canaanite goddesses. In Greece, it's Demeter and Persephone is the Eleusinian mysteries. You've also got the mysteries of Isis that come out of Egypt that were exported all over the Roman Empire. The mysteries of Ishtar was, from Babylon. And so in Ezekiel, it's got the women weeping for Tammuz. Tammuz was the dying, rising god that goes with Ishtar, and that is one of the months of the Jewish calendar. I mean, these are the old Hebrew Israelite traditions.
Yeah,
was that Ishtar and Tammuz was part of their traditions, and that's one of these dying and rising gods. And so then Baal and Astarte, it's Baal and Anat for the Canaanites, and all of these traditions are rooted in these ecstatic sexual sex and drugs kind of religions, where they're doing, it's all like very sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's a lot of music and dance and having a big old good time. And when they say Yahweh says, "I'm a jealous God," this is who he's jealous of, because these were the popular religions.
He's jealous of all of these people having fun. You put all these other gods before me because, damn it, they're just a bit more interesting.
Oh yeah, you go to Ishtar's temple and you get laid. I mean, everyone has more fun at Ishtar's temple than at Yahweh's temple. So these are definitely known, and definitely the drugs are definitely around. I mean, cannabis was 100% around in Jerusalem in that time. It'd been used for thousands of years prior to that.
Well, I'm interested in just because I know nothing about this. What are the sources for this? How do we know that cannabis, for example, was used?
Well, I mean, I've got a whole book on it, and we go to Chris Bennett's work on it. I mean, cannabis is a Neolithic plant. I mean, it's there in Lebanon, and these sites are particularly just up the road in Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley. These are Neolithic sites. These are some of the oldest inhabitations that humanity has. Jericho is a city that's 10,000 years old today. It was 7,000 years old in Old Testament times. And we have plenty of archaeological evidence that cannabis was being grown and being used. I mean, it was totally common because its hemp fiber was a staple backbone fiber of the ancient world. I mean, it was the longest and strongest fiber. So you used it for shipbuilding and bowstrings and tents and awnings and tablecloths and napkins and sackcloth and funeral rites. I mean, it's thoroughly well documented. We can have a debate about exactly what day it arrived, but I'm pretty sure. I mean, it's certainly by the time you get to Jesus's time, it had been well in use for thousands of years. It's well documented in Roman literature.
Oh yeah, I wasn't doubting it. I was just interested in how we know these things, what. But yeah,
I mean, cannabis specifically is thoroughly documented because of its use as a fiber. It was a backbone fiber of the ancient world, so we know it was around. And in that region is a place where you can get both the fiber and the drugs. The Baca Valley in particular is very important. You get the fiber and the drugs being grown there, because in northern latitudes, you get cannabis grows for hemp fiber. So in Europe, it was all hemp and no drugs. And when you go south in India and Egypt, it's all drugs and no fiber. But in the middle regions, it can be the fiber and the drugs. And the Baca Valley of Lebanon is one of these spots. And it's a spot where they grow the finest hashish and marijuana to this day, where they still grow it in Lebanon. It's been growing there forever. So they definitely had potent varieties available, and would have been known to the women in these mystery religions where they make potent mystery potions and concoctions. I mean, I document it all in my book. This stuff goes back a way long way. And then as far as the science goes, cannabis is documented that it doesn't kill, that it, incredibly strong overdoses, they can be very unpleasant. Like when you eat cannabis, when you consume it, smoking it is one chemical pathway, gives you one reaction, but when you eat it or ingest it, it reacts differently. It metabolizes to your liver and you get a different effect. And it can be incredibly strong, and it can be unpleasant, but it doesn't kill. And so, and there was a lot of literature, like in the 19th century in particular, before they understood how cannabis worked, they tested on animals. And so you've got a whole rash of literature on animal testing from the 19th century, where they attempted to establish the fatal limits, like what is the death limit for these, they do it for every drug, and they never could find one for cannabis. When they performed these experiments on dogs, they would give these small dogs these massive overdoses of hashish, and would knock the dogs out for a couple of days, and the dogs would wake up and be just fine. And they repeated these experiments over and over again, and they've never established a fatal limit. There's no fatal limit in human beings. You cannot smoke yourself to death on cannabis, or even eat too much to kill you. Like the DEA, World Health Organization, all of the major science organizations will attest to this, that there is no known fatal death limit for cannabis in a healthy human adult.
So would it be the sort of drug that could send you into, is it a catalepsy that will knock you out, so to speak, and could you still be pierced in the side and not react?
Oh, absolutely.
If you were alive?
Because they used it as a surgical anesthesia. We have the oldest evidence of a surgical anesthetic. Now, it's not from the Middle East, it's from China, but it's around this time period from the 2nd century. Is a very famous, legendary, I talk about it in the paper, legendary Chinese physician who invented the first anesthetic using cannabis.
Yeah, is that How To or something? Yeah.
Yeah. And he called it hemp boiling powder or something, mythicism or something. And they performed complicated surgeries, cutting open people's guts and doing complicated abdominal surgeries on people. And this is the oldest surgical anesthetic we've got. So it certainly could, it'll certainly knock you out so that you don't feel the pain of being stabbed. And the catalepsy effect, not something that happens all the time. It's kind of unusual, but it is also thoroughly documented in the science, in the modern science, that that it can, basically catalepsy is when your limbs get all stiff like your corpse. And you can be lying on the table and the doctor can lift your arm up and then your arm will just stay there, or lift your leg up and your leg will just stay there. And we've got this documented going back centuries of physicians. William O'Shaughnessy was the famous, well, not necessarily famous to you, but famous in the cannabis world as the first doctor from the 1840s who started doing experiments on, first Western doctor to do experiments on cannabis drugs. He was a Scottish physician who went to India in those days, and he documented the catalepsy effect, where he said he was shocked when he found it. He said it's very unusual, but it happened. I chanced to lift up my patient's arm. The professional reader will judge of my astonishment when I found that it remained the posture in which I placed it. It required but a brief examination of the limbs to find that the patient had, by influence of this narcotic, been thrown into that strange and most extraordinary of all nervous conditions, into that state that so few have seen, and the existence of which many still discredit, the genuine catalepsy of the nosologist. I'm not sure what a nosologist is, but but anyway, and the modern science, I go into my paper there. The modern science documents catalepsy as a documented effect in the conventional science.
So the theory would be that he was knocked out by ingesting enough of that drug So it must have been a very potent mixture.
It would have been a very potent mixture. It would have been a very special mixture mixed up by Mary Magdalene personally, or, or she had it mixed up by someone. Um, I'm
And
placing her as the central character for a
yeah,
storytelling device.
and then so that knocks him out. The guards think he's dead. Now, here's something in support of your thesis. So two things in support of your thesis. One, in the Gospels, how does anyone know that that's vinegar or sour wine or whatever the Gospels claim it is in the receptacle for which they put it in a sponge and then lift it up on a pole on hyssop plant stalk, and they lift it up to him and he ingests it from there. But they say it's vinegar or sour wine, but there's no way of how would they know that? How would the Gospel authors know that?
Yeah, I think that's a euphemism for an unknown substance.
Okay. So, but either way, I mean, the skeptic should say, well, in the same way that I would skeptically question how they know that blood and water poured out of him when they pierced his side, like, unless you are right there and you are testing what that is, I think that's clearly a theological claim. Blood and water has some kind of theological meaning. Blood and water didn't pour out of his side, but irrespective of what it was, how does the Gospel author know what it was? So who was the person there testing it? Well, there wouldn't have been anyone, and you wouldn't have been able to get close enough unless you were a guard. Likewise with the drink, how do we know that it was vinegar or sour wine? We don't know that, and that feeds into your thesis that it could have been anything. And the second thing that feeds into your thesis would be, how do we know that Jesus was brain dead when he was taken down from the cross? So
yeah, that's not like there was doctors there with a stethoscope, like doing an examination on them. All they had to do was trick the guards and the onlookers.
It was fair, but it was fairly nebulous. I mean, they Jesus cried out and died, and they said, "Oh, he's dead," and then took him down. The actual claims of the Gospels are really pretty nebulous. There was no checking by the centurion that he was actually sort of dead.
But the one thing that is important is that the Gospels make it clear that they brought him down from the cross early, after just a couple hours. When crucifixions normally take days, and he's brought down after a couple hours, that is a key detail.
Yeah.
Like, he's only up there for 3 or 4 hours, when he should have been up there for 2 days. And and Pontius Pilate is surprised that they brought him down so early. He's really dead already. Is that what he says? So I think that's a really important detail, that the Gospels all make it clear that the crucifixion that he wasn't on the cross for very long, which feeds to the idea that he wasn't really dead.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. Then he's taken away, and if you believe this, I mean, I don't believe this at all, but if you believe the Gospels, then Joseph and possibly Nicodemus are taking him away to be buried in a tomb. The question is here.
They come with medicines, they come with bandages, and they have a very convenient this room, this empty tomb, just waiting for him. This rich man's tomb that just conveniently nearby, waiting for him to be laid down. And to me, this is a straight reading the text says that they sedate him, they bring him down, they bandage him, they lay him in this room that's prepared and ready for him, where he can lay there sedated for 2 days undisturbed. To me, it's a perfect recipe for how you would want to nurse someone back from a set of serious injuries. Like, would you do anything different if you were attempting a wounded soldier off the battlefield? Would there be anything better than to give him heavy sedation, bandage his wounds, and leave him alone for 2 days undisturbed? I think that's the best possible thing you could do for a wounded person. And
indeed, we've got so you could even draw on someone like Josephus, saying that there are crucified people that have been taken down who have survived. You can draw on all the crazy stories of people who we think have died over history and they haven't actually died.
Loads of stories of people who we think dead. I mean, it's not uncommon in the least.
No, there is precedent. So when you're talking about probabilities, you've got a prior probability that something like this is certainly got a greater prior probability before we even look at the evidence than the Christian thesis, right? So again, if you're comparing it to the Christian thesis, it's more probable. I'm with you on that. So the question really is, what makes this more probable than any other naturalistic hypothesis? And you are saying that a straight reading of the Gospels, to use
straight reading the text, and then the tradition says that people saw him alive. So the mythicist who says that Jesus was never, none of this stuff ever happened, has got to explain why these stories persisted and why these stories were seen to have credibility.
True.
Because I don't think Paul has credibility personally. Paul was not there. He did not see Jesus. He did not meet Jesus. He never knew Jesus. He did not seem to get along with the original disciples. I don't think Paul has any credibility at all. I think Paul comes along and meets these people who were the witnesses. They had credibility and they convinced Paul, and then Paul went out and spread the stories.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, Paul is spreading the stories among people that these stories are out there. If you accept that Paul was a real person and that he really was visiting these churches in the 50s, that means there is already a community of people that believe that Jesus was seen alive after the crucifixion. And that Paul's not convincing them. They already know. Paul's convincing new people, but there's already a community of believers that believe separate from Paul, and that Paul is in this milieu. And I don't think Paul personally has any credibility at all. I think Paul is spreading stories that are out there, and then Paul is elaborating on the stories and making them divine. I think Paul is the one who. So I talked to Dr. Price about this, Dr. Robert Price. He said that he thought swoon theory was actually a prevalent theory. And I'd like to talk to him again about this again, but he was of the opinion that swoon theory was a prevalent theory for many centuries, that he felt that it was not uncommon at all, that a lot of people believed it. And again, the Muslims believe it. They don't talk about the drugs or anything, but they believe that he was seen alive. So
yeah, I think in the early days of biblical higher criticism, I think swoon theory did prevail, to some degree.
Yeah. So I lost my train of thought there, but
Sorry.
The idea is that so that these stories have credibility, that the notion that there were credible witnesses who saw the guy alive, that convinced other people that, yeah, we really did see it. It's not just my crazy Aunt Sally who's out there in some cult who's saying all strange shit again. Because like those stories don't have credibility. When you know someone's a cult member, when you know your neighbor or your relative is like a kook, you're not going to take their stories about, seeing somebody alive seriously. But somehow these stories did gain credibility, and somehow these stories did gain traction, because I think that people did see it. And frankly, I'm of the opinion that people may well have understood that he simply faked his death, that one thing I'd like to talk about is his brother James, because James, brother of Jesus, as far as I know, and you've read these stuff a lot more closely than I have, that he never once says that the implication is that James did see Jesus post crucifixion, but nowhere in the book of James or in any of the things that are credited to James does he ever actually say, my brother is divine, my brother is the Lord, my brother was resurrected by God. As far as I know, James never says anything like that, right?
And this is the key: is how did the divinity of Jesus develop? Because my feeling is that the synoptics were presenting Jesus as a Messiah, and you didn't get the divinity until later. So John, so you do have this development over that first sort of first 300 years, but first sort of 60 to 80 years of like who was Jesus, and was he just some sort of exalted Messiah figure, and how would that fit in with someone like, for example, James? And then what does he do? Of course, there's so many inferences to be made here, because
there really sure is.
We can't access the sources in the way that we would like, and we're having second, third, tertiary evidences, and it's all so problematic.
Yeah, and another key, important point I think to make is that we're in agreement about the Gospels developed that Jesus increasingly mythologize, increasingly make him increasingly into a divinity over time, from the first to the fourth Gospels, but they're all written post destruction of Jerusalem after the war. Yeah. And so all the people that were alive that would have known Jesus, the original Jewish disciples, all the people that would have been the first eye count witnesses, they're all dead.
Yeah.
For the most part, after the year 70. And I think that's when the stories of him becoming a god really start to take off, that the people that were there at the time, they're like, no, we know what happened. James, brother Jesus, he's like, Paul, you're a crazy man. He's not God. He's a prophet. And he's a holy man, but we know what happened. We know he simply survived.
Yeah. So this is interesting that you think that early church were perpetuating the lie. So would you present that these people were fooling their congregations, their newfound congregations, in lying about how.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, the implications of the women did it meant it's basically like three witches around a cauldron whipping up something like out of Macbeth, where, you know, where it's the witches that were responsible for the resurrection. And for the patriarchal church fathers, that's just not an acceptable explanation. They would prefer the explanation that it's supernatural and done by God, because that confirms that's how they build their authority around that. To give credit to the women would undermine the entire church that they're attempting to build. So I think even if they did know the story, and I think it's entirely possible that they did know in the early days that Mary Magdalene was responsible, and that this swoon theory, because I think, frankly, I think the book of John is giving it away. I think that they wouldn't have kept these details in there if it wasn't there for a reason.
So
I
it's
think
not.
that,
So when Jesus was appearing to people, you're saying that actually Jesus was in on it and making them think that he had resurrected, so they genuinely had resurrection appearance
and
belief.
I think Jesus actually dies. I think he's pretty badly wounded. I think he makes some appearances in the fact that people see him alive, but when they say he ascended to heaven 40 days later, I take that to mean he actually died 40 days later,
Right.
succumbs to his injuries, infections, or what have you. I think he's pretty seriously wounded. Um, and so I think he dies 40 days later. That's my take on it. And that, so people saw him, but, you know, the stories of seeing, you know, this wounded, you know, mangled up guy, those aren't very compelling stories. So then the stories get dressed up like fishtails, like fishermen. So then they make him always walking through walls and he's appearing like a ghost and stuff, because that's the kind of compelling supernatural stories that make for good mythologies. The truth is not a good mythology, you know. But the appearance stories in the Gospels are all very vague, as you know, like there's no detail that you can hang your hat on in any of them. So I think those stories are clearly all made up, but it's like,
They're certainly very mythological or theological, you know. So
yeah,
I think, you know, the road to Emmaus is pulling on, you know, Greek literary tropes, like the fact that you wouldn't recognize Jesus after if you were a follower of Jesus, you know, and walking along a road for ages with him, and then you only recognize him when you sit down and break bread with him, is
yeah.
obviously nonsense from a literal point of view, and obviously walking through walls and things like that. So yeah, I think there's a whole overlay of mythology and theology, and the question is, well, was there really something that underwrites that forms that kind of nugget of truth underneath these, which would
Yeah, so
be.
I think the nugget of truth is that there were credible witnesses who saw him alive, and then the stories get dressed up by Paul and other people to become increasingly mythologized. Um, and I think Paul is probably the first one to really start spreading the stories that this whole thing is divine and that Jesus is Lord, and Jesus is God. But like I said, I think Paul is slightly crazy.
Yeah, so I mean, my view would be that is it plausible? I mean, it depends how you define plausible. So it's something that could happen. Is it something that probably happened? I would still say probably not. Is it more plausible than the Christian account? Definitely, 100%. I put a swoon theory miles above the Christian theory every day of the week. I suppose the key for me would be, it depends upon the vinegar being fed to Jesus. I think that's key. And if that didn't happen, like the story becomes problematic. I think that quote from Psalm 69 might be a problem for your thesis. But otherwise, it generally can fit in with you know, just with every other naturalistic theory. It fits broadly with the data.
You
I
know, I actually, so thanks. You know, I agree with you. And then, but I'm really actually really interested in this as a storytelling device. You know, religion, all these things, all these religions are fictions in the sense that, you know, all these stories, whether it's the Bhagavad Gita or the Bible or Buddha, all these stories, they've all got a fiction at the heart of them. And that's not, the issue isn't whether, you know, Krishna really walked the earth the way these stories told. The question is whether, you know, what do these stories teach us, and what meaning can we derive from these stories? And being hung up on literal truth, that's a Christian and Muslim thing, because they want to claim all this authority. You know, Christianity is really like this, it's an authority cult, it's a mind control authority, and where truth is not the issue, authority is the issue. um So for church fathers and for apologists, it's always, their arguments are always going to come back to confirming the authority of the Bible or of the Catholic Church. They're never going to take a position that undermines their authority. So they will bend themselves into logical pretzels. They'll bend over backwards to say anything. They can still defend their authority because it doesn't really matter if it's honest or not. I mean, they've been feeding us lines of bullshit for 1,500 years now. And so it's always about authority. So I think that like, retelling these stories in a way, rather than just saying they didn't happen, because think about the atheist and saying these stories didn't happen, is that actually confirms the Christian worldview. Because the Christian already says there are believers and unbelievers. They already, from their perspective, they already divide the world into those who believe and those who don't believe. And they say right in the Gospels that there are lots of people who don't believe us. So when the atheist comes along and says, oh, none of this stuff ever happened, to the Christian, that's just confirming the Christian worldview. To me, I think it's really powerful to take these stories and take the gospel and reimagine them and reinterpret them and take the same data, say, yeah, sure, I believe in God. Sure, I believe in Jesus. He's just fine. But I don't believe in the story the way you tell it. And I don't believe in your authority because I believe in the story in a completely different way, like in the Gnostics. I mean, who's to say Paul was right? Who's to say that the Pauline traditions are the correct orthodoxy as opposed to the Gnostics? Who's to
And
say
that's
that?
a very valid question. I know that Gnostics these days, like they aren't seen. In fact, the Westhour Institute have now dismissed the term Gnostics in a sort of fairly formal way, as to not being a group of people, but to be like a loose number of different beliefs, which
Right.
certain
I agree
certain
with that.
groups
It's like an
have.
umbrella
So
term, like
yeah,
Indian.
exactly.
Like
Yeah,
Indian
yeah,
doesn't mean any one tribe, and there's hundreds of American tribes that come under the term Indian.
yeah.
So you have to be careful when you're using these loose terms. And Gnostic is like that. It's a very loose term.
Yeah, but I think it's fascinating to think of these alternative histories where maybe Marcionism won out, or this kind of Docetism or whatever it is. That there was such a variety of beliefs in the early Christian world that and you have the non-canonical gospels. Well, and apocryphal texts that were written, they weren't written in vacuums. It wasn't just one person making up a jolly good story and then putting it out there. It's like representing probably a community of people believing these things, and arguably, and I find that fascinating that there were such disparate views about Christ and Christianity at the time. And then obviously this throws into that mix as well. But so what would be your objective then, really, of presenting this thesis?
Oh, well, I mean, my whole thing, history of the goddess is, I believe in the divine mother. I believe that there is a mother to go with the father. Now, I believe all the gods are projections of the human mind. Don't get me wrong. The question is, are these useful projections? And so, I think there is a mother to go with the father, and that the key thing of monotheism is that it's a religion of father where they deny the mother and they deny the existence of a divine mother. We have no divine mother in the West, no concept of a divine mother. We don't respect women and femininity or nature. We're separated from all these things. I frankly think we need to put the mother back on her pedestal. I'm raised Protestant. I come from the Protestant traditions. I think one thing the Protestants got, I think the Protestants did a lot of good things in breaking away from the Catholic Church. I remember going to Catholic high school and being like, wow, thank God we had a Reformation because these people are insane. Um, uh, but I think the Protestants got some things wrong. I think, they knocked the Virgin. The one thing the Catholics really do well is the Virgin Mary. That's the most redeeming part of the Catholic traditions is the Virgin, even if she isn't a goddess, even if she's been demoted in status, the Protestants do it worse because they don't even acknowledge her at all. They completely knock her off her pedestal.
There's
And
a
it's here in the West.
duality. So there's a duality that you're arguing for that is missing in monotheism, such as the Abrahamic faith.
Yes, it's the error of monotheism,
Yeah.
or the lie of monotheism, if you will, that they say that it's all father and no mother, and that they deny the mother. And not only they deny the mother, they're violently hostile to the traditions of the mother. Homosexuality, transgenderism, plant drugs. These things are being, indigenous views where you're a part of nature. These are all the traditions of the mother.
Yeah, and
And
then you can go back obviously to Yahweh and Asherah, the consort of Asherah, and ideas that of Yahweh that were very different at the onset of the Torah. But yeah.
Yeah, so I think we need to put the mother back on her pedestal, not tear down. I've kind of got my own view on things. Like I don't fall outside the all that we're always hearing this debate. Do you believe in God or not believe in God? Do you believe in God or not believe in God? Does God exist? Or either you're a Christian or you're an atheist, Christian or atheist. Back and forth, like this binary argument that I've been listening to all my life. Actually, I think there's a different argument. Like I think that instead of tearing down God, let's bring back Goddess. Bring back the Divine Mother. I'm not a religious leader. I'm not trying to get anyone to follow me, but I think these are important conversations.
So it's almost a functional benefit of such beliefs in representing the human psyche in a meaningful way that's useful and healthy.
Well, it's also just practical in terms of like re-establishing our connection to ecology, because like look around, industrial civilization's going over the cliff ecologically. We are, the way our civilization is structured right now, it is built to fail, ecologically speaking. It will crash, it will break. I don't know when, I don't know where, I don't know how, but it's bound to happen. And at some point, we're going to need to, as a society, re-establish a genuine and meaningful connection to nature if we expect to survive for another 1,000 years, because we're not the way we're going right now.
Well, you get
and our religious viewpoints hold us back, and Enlightenment thinking holds us back.
You get no disagreement with me on the ecological point, that's for sure. Yes, so that's interesting. So what are you looking to do with the swoon theory that you've got now?
Oh, I'm turning this all into a big art project, and then hopefully graphic novels. But I've got some art. You can actually see it on my Twitter feed. I've got this fellow Juan Hernandez has been sending me some fantastic art. And we're turning this into a big art project. Can't really say anything more about it just yet, but hopefully by the new year, it's only a month, but hopefully we'll have something presentable here in a couple of weeks. And then, so I'm doing two big stories. The Gnostic Mystery Jesus, I call it, is the one, which is just sort of a short story. And then a very long story of the Epic of Ishtar, which combines the stories of Inanna from Sumer, Ishtar from Babylon, and then Astarte from the Old Testament into one meta narrative that shows the rise and ultimate fall of the great goddess. Because everyone recognizes that Inanna and Ishtar are one goddess with just two different names, but people don't really recognize that Astarte from the Old Testament is also the same goddess, and that it's all one big narrative, and that you see her being overthrown in the Old Testament. Partly it's a little bit hidden because her name isn't quite clear in the Old Testament. She's called Ashtaroth. She's called a couple of different names. She's called the Queen of Heaven. But the Ashtaroth just means shame. It just means shameful Astarte. And she's a sexual goddess. She's the holy harlot. So it's all the ritual prostitution and everything that she oversees. And so they're slut shaming her effectively. But King Solomon worshipped Astarte. It's very clear. They criticize him for it. Song of Songs is this old liturgies from the sacred marriage. These are all remnants of the Israelite paganism when the goddesses were still, quite potent. And so, but then you see them being overthrown. You see Astarte being knocked off her pedestal in the Old Testament. So I want to turn this all into one big meta narrative. It's actually going to be pretty cool. And so that's what we're working on.
Is it a case of sort of reinventing or representing?
Representing. I mean, I'm just going to take the original stories and then just turn them into, art and graphic novels.
Right.
But it's when you string them all together that you get, when you look at them all as individual stories, they're disassociated from one another. You don't see this character arc. But there is in fact a character arc, and because traditionally it's considered rude or taboo to talk about the Bible as mythology, or to point out that these Old Testament gods are actually part of a broader mythical narrative, that they're part of them. It's not just a response to Mesopotamian, like the Old Testament isn't just like influenced by Mesopotamian mythology. It's a continuation of Mesopotamian mythology.
And so I'm writing a third book in my trilogy of Nativity, Easter, and then I'm writing one on the Exodus at the moment. And And that's a really important point that I think is overlooked. So when people go for some sort of biblical exceptionalism, they look at, say, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, the Christian Bible altogether, and they say this is the truth here as some kind of thing without foundation or without continuation before it. It's just in and of itself
Self-contained, emerged from
self-contained.
nowhere.
Exactly, self-contained unit. It emerged from nowhere, and all you need to do is look at something like the covenant code. You just need to look at the legal codes in the Old Testament and see, well, that comes, there's a continuum from, you know, them to the Hittite law codes and the Hittite law codes, and then you've got the code of Hammurabi, and then you've got older ones, and you've got ones in between, and there's actually like about 8 different law codes that form this very coherent evolution of legal code that goes up to the Bible. But then you've got to remember it goes through the Bible until now we get.
Yes, I talk about this explicitly. The Kadesha are the priestesses in the Old Testament. They're the temple prostitutes. They're really priestesses, and they were actually quite highly respected people. So they're there in Mesopotamia as well, and they're in the law codes. They're in Hammurabi's law codes, and the older ones, and they talk about the consecrated woman and what her property rights are and her inheritance rights and such. And they appear in all the various law codes, all have them. And you see the gradual loss of their property rights. As when you put all the law codes in order, you see how the consecrated woman lose their rights until you get to the law codes of Deuteronomy, where they say you won't be a Kadesha at all. And they put them out of business. Yeah. And so like and you can put them all in a row and show how in the oldest law codes, the Kadesha have the greatest rights. By the time you get to Deuteronomy, they're completely out of business.
And then what's interesting, so the point is that it doesn't stop at the Bible. So you go to the UN Charter of Human Rights now and modern law codes, and then back through time, and you can see there's just the evolution of law, right? And morality, and it's just fascinating. But to go, hang on, I'm going to forget that bit there, and I'm going to forget this bit now, and I'm just going to concentrate on this little bit here and say this is exceptional and has no continuation or previous sort of foundation. It is just in and of itself, bosh, the truth. It's obviously not how to do any kind of academic discipline.
No, because it's all about confirming their authority.
Yeah.
They want to isolate everything else. And so they're so loath to admit that there's any pagan connections to anything about Christianity, because that would undermine the narrative that they've been spinning for a long time, that this was, you know, handed to us directly by the creator of the universe. I mean, it's such absurd.
Yes. Agreed. Well, look, that was really interesting. Is there anything else you wanted to add specifically about anything about the Swoon?
No, not without starting a whole new conversation. This has been really great. I'd love to talk to you some more though, John. You know, like I know you do a lot of stuff on free will. I'd love to chat with you about that sometime.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm sure we'll be determined to.
So but yeah, as I'm moving forward, like I'm doing this art project, you know, I've been dabbling my book came out earlier this year, and I've been dabbling with like what the next step is, like podcasting, YouTubing, and I kind of backed off doing my own YouTube stuff just because I don't have the time or energy to make my own movies. But I am moving forward with this art project, and my Substack blog I'll be relaunching. So I will looking to be out there and looking to get these stories out there and getting conversations about them for sure.
Well, for sure. You know, you can always use me. I'll be more than happy to entertain, you know, us.
Oh, and also I'm going to publish this paper somewhere. And if you notice anything I should fix, any details or any comments, I'd appreciate any feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. I can speak to you about that in a minute offline, but yeah, okay. Definitely. But again, you're free to put that on my blog. But the only thing I'd say with when you do so many things, I'm at the moment doing many different things, and there is the risk of, you know, like a man to double business bound. You the more you split yourself up, the less well you do any individual thing. So that's always the risk, isn't it? When you're like, I want to do a bit of YouTubing and blogging and writing and public talk. The
YouTubing is just too much, takes up too much of my time. I can't spend all my weekends editing videos. I get resentful that I don't have a social life.
Yeah, I'm just a sad loser. But yeah, no. Let's do this again. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much. And thank you, where can we find you?
Let's see. The best place to find me. My My old website is edwardtdodge.com. I've got a Substack, edwarddodge.substack.com. That's probably gonna be the best place to find me going forward. On Twitter, I think I'm like Edward_T_Dodge, which is sort of an annoying link. But yeah, you can, the Edward Dodge, the History of the Goddess, historyofthegoddess.com has a website. I've got a bunch of websites, none of which are up to snuff, but
check them out.
Yeah. But
Awesome.
yeah, check it out. Buy my book if you'd like to. I'm happy to talk about this stuff anytime.
Do it. Okay, well, look, it'd be really interesting to talk to you about that book actually next time. But in the meantime, thanks so much for your time. You take care and good luck with everything.
Thanks, John. You too.